The alien woman's request shocked me. I want you to be my husband, just for tonight. Ray had always considered himself an experienced captain, well-versed in the endless variety of beings and cultures he encountered during his intergalactic travels. As a merchant and trader, he had bargained with diplomats from distant worlds, bartered with smugglers on lawless stations, and shared drinks with miners from the outermost colonies. Nothing ever truly surprised him. But that night, standing on the crowded promenade of a distant spaceport, everything changed. The spaceport buzzed with activity, as ships from all corners of the galaxy docked and departed, unloading exotic goods and passengers. Ray adjusted his jacket as he strolled through the lively corridor, watching the colorful mix of species, the clattering of boots on metal, and the hum of voices speaking a dozen different languages. He had a few hours before his next meeting with a supplier, and he figured he'd use the time to stretch his legs. As he walked, a soft voice suddenly called out to him, cutting through the noise. "Excuse me, Captain." Ray turned around, half expecting to see one of his fellow traders looking for a deal. Instead, he was faced with a woman. At first, he thought she was human, but there was something different about her. She stood taller than most women, with an elegant posture that immediately made her stand out among the crowd. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, almost glowing under the artificial lighting of the station. Her eyes were an unusual violet, and her silver hair cascaded down her back in soft waves. She wore a simple yet elegant outfit, a flowing dress with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer as she moved. Ray blinked. She didn't look like she belonged to any particular species he had encountered before. And judging by the way others quickly moved aside to make way for her, she was someone important. "Can I help you?" Ray asked, a little unsure of himself. The woman's smile was soft, but her eyes were serious, as though she carried a weight far beyond her years. She took a step closer, her presence almost magnetic. "I need your help," she said, her voice smooth and calm, yet there was an urgency in her tone that caught Ray off guard. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," Ray replied, sensing something unusual in the air around them. "I'm just passing through. I don't know what kind of help." Before he could finish, the woman interrupted him, her gaze unwavering. "I want you to be my husband just for tonight." Ray froze. The words hit him like a sudden storm. He looked around to see if anyone else had heard, but the bustling crowds continued on their way, oblivious to the strange request that had just been made. His first instinct was to laugh, but the look on her face told him she wasn't joking. "Excuse me?" Ray asked, feeling his heart beat a little faster. "What are you talking about? You want me to what, marry you?" The woman nodded solemnly. "Yes, but not in the way you think. It is not a real marriage, at least not in the traditional sense. I need you to play the role of my husband for a single night. That's all, nothing more." Ray could only stare at her, baffled. "I don't understand. Why me, and why for just one night?" The woman seemed to hesitate, as if weighing how much to reveal. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "It is a matter of great importance. My name is Elira. I am an ambassador of my people, and my race is on the brink of war. There is an ancient tradition on my planet that requires me to take a temporary bond with someone from another species, someone not involved in the conflict. The bond, even if it is only for a night, is meant to symbolize unity and peace. I need you to fulfill this role." Ray's mind was racing. He had never heard of anything like this. A temporary bond between strangers to stop a war. It sounded absurd, yet something in Elira's eyes told him that she was serious, desperate even. "And you think I'm the one to do this?" Ray asked, still confused but intrigued. "Why me? Why not someone else?" Elira's eyes softened as she looked at him. "I believe you are the one who can help me," she said simply. "The ceremony requires someone who is not involved in the conflict, someone whose perspective is outside the war. You, Captain, are a traveler. You have seen countless worlds, countless peoples. You understand how fragile peace can be." She paused. "And your species, humans, are known for their empathy. You have the ability to understand what others cannot." Ray took a step back, absorbing her words. He had seen war, its brutality, its endless cycle, but he had never been asked to participate in something like this. He wasn't a diplomat or a peacemaker. He was just a trader trying to make a living. "I don't know," Ray said, still uncertain. "I'm no hero, Elira. I'm not the kind of person you need for something like this." Elira's expression didn't change, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I know this is a lot to ask of you, and I understand if you cannot help. but my people are on the brink of annihilation. If we do not stop the war, everything we have built will be destroyed." Ray looked into her eyes, seeing the weight of what she carried. It wasn't just a plea for help, it was a last chance to save her people. She wasn't asking for him to fight or to lead armies. She was asking for something simpler, something more human. "All right," Ray said, finally making up his mind. "I'll help you, but I still don't understand what this bond really means. What happens after tonight?" Elira's smile returned, though it was bittersweet. "After tonight, I will return to my people, and perhaps the bond will be enough to save us. But even if it does not, I will know that I did everything I could." Ray nodded, still processing everything. He had agreed, but the enormity of what he had just gotten himself into was starting to sink in. This wasn't just another trade deal or a diplomatic meeting. This was something much bigger. Elira's planet, her people, their very future, everything was riding on a single night. The air between them seemed to grow heavier, filled with unspoken tension. Elira stepped closer, her presence overwhelming in the best way. "Thank you, Ray," she said softly, her voice tinged with gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Ray looked at her, feeling a strange mixture of empathy and curiosity. "I don't know what I'm getting myself into, but I'll help however I can." With that, Elira led him toward a quiet corner of the spaceport where a small shuttle waited, ready to take them to a nearby station. Ray still didn't understand the full extent of what he had agreed to, but he couldn't deny the pull of her request. There was something about her, something beyond the alien beauty she projected. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew he couldn't walk away. As they boarded the shuttle, Ray's thoughts wandered. He had made his choice, but the journey ahead would be one he would never forget. The fate of an entire world rested in his hands, and all he had to do was play the part of a husband, just for tonight. Ray sat in the shuttle beside Elira, his mind racing. The small vessel glided silently through the dark expanse of space, the stars twinkling in the distance. He had agreed to her request, but the more he thought about it, the more surreal it felt. This wasn't just another trade or deal he could walk away from when it was over. This was different. This was personal. Elira sat across from him, her violet eyes watching him closely, as though waiting for him to say something. Her calm demeanor only made the weight of the situation feel heavier. She seemed to have an air of grace, but Ray could sense that beneath it all, there was something far deeper, a sense of urgency that was almost impossible to ignore. The shuttle continued its steady course toward a distant space station, far from the crowded and chaotic port they had just left behind. Ray could feel the tension in the air between them. He had agreed to help her, but what did it mean? What was this bond she spoke of? He glanced at her, wondering how she could stay so composed under such pressure. The fate of her people hung in the balance, and here she was, quiet and resolute. But Ray wasn't entirely sure she was telling him everything. She had explained the tradition, the ancient ritual, but there was still so much he didn't understand. "Elira," Ray said, breaking the silence, "you keep saying that this is important, that this bond can change everything for your people, but I still don't get it. What exactly happens tonight? What's the real purpose of all this?" Elira looked at him, her eyes softening. "It's not just about the ritual, it's about the symbolism. My people have been at war for generations. There are factions within our society that refuse to compromise, and they're tearing us apart. The ritual is a way to bring unity, even if it's temporary. But the bond created between us is not just for the war, it represents something greater. It's a gesture of peace, of hope." Ray nodded slowly, trying to grasp her words. "So you're telling me that this night, this ritual is a way to stop the war? You really think a single night can make a difference?" Elira's gaze drifted out the shuttle window as she spoke, her voice low and filled with sadness. "It's not about what happens tonight, Ray. It's about what it represents. The unity of two different people coming together in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a reminder that peace is possible, that people can find common ground, even when it seems impossible." Ray felt a pang of empathy for her. She was so certain that this was the key to ending her people's suffering, yet he could see the doubt in her eyes. She had put all her hope into this ritual, and now she was asking him to help her carry it out. "Do you believe it will work?" Ray asked quietly. Elira turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I have to believe it will." The shuttle's engines hummed steadily, but Ray could hear the anxiety in her voice. She was a diplomat, a leader, yet here she was, relying on a stranger to help save her world. It was a heavy burden, one that Ray wasn't sure he was prepared for. The shuttle began to slow as they approached the space station, a massive structure that seemed to float in the void like an isolated city. Ray could see the faint outline of its docking bays, and the lights of the station flickered in the distance. This was where the ceremony would take place, where Elira's people would observe the ritual. As they landed and the shuttle doors opened, Ray followed Elira down the narrow corridor of the station. The place was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of machinery filling the air. The walls were smooth, metallic, and cold, giving the station a sterile, almost lifeless feel. Ray couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they walked deeper into the station. It was as if they were stepping into a place that wasn't meant for outsiders. Elira led him through a series of hallways, her steps purposeful and confident, though Ray noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. She was trying to appear calm, but he could see the weight of the situation pressing down on her. He followed her silently, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. Finally, they arrived at a large chamber at the heart of the station. The room was dimly lit, with soft, ambient lighting casting long shadows along the walls. In the center of the room was a circular platform, raised slightly off the ground. Around it were a handful of figures, all wearing dark robes that obscured their faces. Ray couldn't tell if they were human or alien, but their presence was imposing. They stood in a perfect circle, watching intently as Elira entered the room. "This is it," Elira whispered, turning to Ray. "The ritual will begin soon." Ray's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been part of anything like this before. He had bargained for rare minerals, struck deals for star maps, but nothing had ever felt as heavy as this. He was about to take part in something far bigger than himself, and yet he still didn't understand how he fit into all of it. He turned to Elira. "What exactly do I have to do?" Elira took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "You just need to stand with me, Ray. The bond will form naturally, but it requires both of us to give ourselves fully to the ceremony. There is no turning back once we begin." Ray nodded, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his head. He had already agreed to this, and now there was no going back. He stepped onto the platform beside Elira, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The robed figures around them began to chant in a language Ray didn't understand. The sound was deep and resonant, echoing through the room as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. Elira closed her eyes, her face serene but focused, and Ray followed her lead. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the air around them seemed to hum with energy, and he could feel a strange sensation building in his chest. A soft glow began to emanate from the platform, and Ray could see Elira's hands slowly moving toward his. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. As soon as their fingers touched, a wave of warmth spread through him, and a flood of images and emotions rushed into his mind. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was deeper than that. He felt Elira's pain, her hope, her desperation, and her resolve. He could feel her people's suffering, their endless struggle for peace, and her tireless fight to stop the war. For a moment, Ray was overwhelmed. It was as though he had become a part of her and she a part of him. He could no longer separate his thoughts from hers. Everything she felt, he felt. The chanting grew louder, more intense, as the energy between them grew. Ray's heart beat faster and his breath quickened as the bond deepened. The figures around them continued their chants, their voices rising in unison. Ray didn't understand the words, but he could sense the power in them, the weight of centuries of tradition. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the energy around them surged, and Ray was thrown back, gasping for air. He looked at Elira, who was still standing before him, her eyes closed as if in deep concentration. The room fell silent, and Ray could feel the weight of the moment settle over him. He had taken part in something far bigger than himself, something that could change the fate of an entire world. But as the ceremony ended, a new realization hit him. What had just happened? Was it real, or was it just an illusion created by the ritual? For the first time, Ray truly understood the power of what he had just become a part of. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was a bridge between two worlds, two people from completely different walks of life, coming together to create something greater than themselves. As the chanting faded, Ray turned to Elira, his mind spinning with the events that had just unfolded. "What now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Elira opened her eyes, her expression serene, yet filled with an emotion Ray couldn't quite place. "Now we wait," she said softly. "Now we see if our bond can save my people." Ray stood there for a moment trying to catch his breath. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. Elira's hand was still in his, warm and steady, and he could feel the lingering pulse of the energy they had just shared. It was as if a connection had been forged between them, one that was impossible to explain. His heart was still racing, his mind struggling to make sense of everything that had just happened. The room around them was quiet now, the robed figures who had chanted still and unmoving. Elira stepped back, releasing his hand, but the strange sensation lingered, as if her presence was etched into him. The bond, whatever it was, had become real in a way that Ray couldn't fully comprehend. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ray's thoughts were jumbled, and he struggled to put them into words. What had just occurred? Was it all just some ancient ritual, or had something deeper happened between them? Elira finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft, but there was a new strength in it, something that hadn't been there before. "It's done," she said. "The bond is formed." Ray nodded, still feeling the weight of the moment. He could feel the power in her words, even though he didn't understand everything about the ritual. What he did understand was that Elira had trusted him, had placed her hopes for her people's future in his hands. The responsibility he now carried was something that could not be ignored. Does it feel different to you?" Ray asked, his voice hesitant. Elira's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. "It feels right," she said softly. "I can feel the connection, I can feel you." Ray's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but the intensity in her gaze made him realize just how much was at stake here. This wasn't just a fleeting moment for her. This bond meant something more than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just a diplomat or a leader. She was someone who had risked everything to save her people. Elira turned away from him and walked toward the edge of the room, her footsteps echoing softly on the cold floor. Ray watched her, his mind racing. The room felt different now, as though it had shifted in some way, becoming charged with a quiet tension. The figures in the robes remained still, but their presence was heavy, like silent watchers who were waiting for something to happen. "What happens now?" Ray asked, his voice breaking the silence. Elira paused, her back still to him, and took a deep breath. She seemed to gather herself before turning back to face him. "Now we wait," she said. "The factions on my planet will know what has happened tonight. They will feel the bond between us, even if they don't fully understand it, and they will make their decision." Ray didn't fully understand what she meant. "Make their decision?" Elira nodded. "The war is not just between my people and our enemies. There are factions within my own society that will decide whether this ritual is enough to end the fighting or whether it's too little, too late. The bond between us is a symbol. It is a sign that peace can be achieved, but it is not a guarantee." Ray felt a weight settle in his chest. He had known that the situation was serious, but he hadn't fully grasped how fragile Elira's people's hope was. A single gesture, a single night, could determine the fate of millions. He had been part of something that had the potential to either save a world or plunge it further into chaos. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of responsibility. "So you're saying that we won't know for sure if it worked until—" Ray trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Elira's gaze softened. "Yes, we won't know until the factions decide, but this ritual, this bond, it is the last hope we have. If they do not accept it, then there may be nothing left for us." Ray's heart sank at the finality in her words. He wanted to help. He wanted to believe that this ritual could bring peace, but the weight of her words was like a heavy stone pressing against his chest. He had never been part of something so important, so delicate. He had spent his life navigating the vastness of space, dealing in trade and business, never having to make a choice like this. But now, he was caught up in something that felt far beyond anything he had ever known. He stepped closer to Elira, not sure what to say, but feeling the need to offer some kind of comfort. "I don't know if this will work either," he said quietly, "but I'll be here for as long as it takes. You're not alone in this." Elira turned to him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, the coldness that had always surrounded her seemed to melt away, and Ray saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. She was holding on to hope, but there was a part of her that feared it might slip away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can't do this without you. We can't." The weight of her gratitude hit Ray harder than he expected. It wasn't just about fulfilling a role in a ceremony. It was about standing by her, about offering support in a time of desperate need. It was something deeper than he had anticipated when he had agreed to help her. This was no longer just a ritual. It was a fight for a future that seemed uncertain at best. Ray stayed with her as the hours passed, the silence between them stretching longer and longer. The robed figures had left, their part in the ceremony now complete. Elira had told him that the bond had been formed, but there was still so much left to do. They could not undo the war, but they could give her people a symbol of peace, a symbol that they could cling to as they made their decision. Ray couldn't help but think about what it would mean for him if the ritual didn't work. If the factions refused to accept it, what would happen to Elira? What would happen to her people? And what about him? He had come into this mission as a simple trader, but now he was caught in the web of something much larger. He knew that he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. The bond they shared, the connection they had forged, was more than just a ritual. It was something that tied them together in a way that went beyond understanding. "Do you think it will work?" Ray asked, his voice low. Elira's expression grew distant and she looked away. "I have to believe it will. If we don't, then there is no hope, and without hope we have nothing." Ray nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't just about the ceremony. It was about something far deeper, something that was now etched into both of their lives. Whether the factions accepted the bond or not, they had given everything they had. All they could do now was wait. As the night wore on, Ray found himself reflecting on the path that had led him here. He had traveled the stars, seen the wonders of the galaxy, but nothing had ever been this important. The connection he shared with Elira was not something he had expected, but now that it was there, he couldn't deny its power. He didn't know what the future would hold for her or for her people. But one thing was certain. They had taken the first step toward peace, and he would stand by Elira until the very end. The days that followed felt like an eternity to Ray. The station was quiet, and time seemed to drag on with every passing moment. Elira had spent most of her time in private meetings with her people, communicating with the factions on her planet who would decide the outcome of the bond they had formed. Ray, on the other hand, was left alone in his quarters, unable to escape the feeling of helplessness that hung in the air. He couldn't shake the memory of that night, the ritual, the connection, the bond that had been created between him and Elira. It felt as though something had been set in motion, something that could either save or destroy an entire world. Ray wasn't a hero, but now he found himself caught in something that was much bigger than himself. All he could do was wait and hope that the bond would be enough to end the war. He spent his days pacing the small, sterile room, looking out at the stars beyond the station's windows. The silence of space had always been comforting to him, but now it felt oppressive. He couldn't stop thinking about Elira. She had trusted him, had relied on him to help save her people, and now she was carrying the weight of their future on her shoulders. He wondered if she felt the same anxiety that he did, if she was just as uncertain about the outcome as he was. Late one evening, after what felt like days of waiting, Elira returned to his quarters. Her face was weary, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes that Ray hadn't seen before. She didn't speak at first, but her presence filled the room, and Ray immediately felt the shift in the air. She had just returned from a meeting with the leaders of her people, and he knew that whatever had happened there would change everything. Elira sat down across from him, and Ray could see the tension in her shoulders. It was clear that whatever news she had brought with her wasn't easy to share. "Elira, what happened?" Ray asked, his voice filled with concern. She took a deep breath and looked up at him, her expression serious. "The factions have spoken," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet desperation. "They've reached a decision." Ray's heart raced. He leaned forward, waiting for her to continue. "And?" he asked, the single word hanging in the air like a lifeline. Elira's gaze dropped to her hands, and for a moment the silence between them seemed unbearable. Finally, she looked back at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "They have agreed to accept the bond," she said quietly. Ray blinked, not quite processing the words. They've accepted it," he repeated as if trying to convince himself of what she was saying. "That's it, the war is over." Elira shook her head slowly. "Not yet, the bond is only the first step. The factions have agreed to the symbol of unity, but they are still wary. They need more time to decide if they can truly trust it. They need to see if we can bring about real change, if the bond is not just a fleeting gesture." Ray's mind raced. "So, what now? What happens next?" Elira stood up and moved to the window, gazing out at the vast emptiness of space. Her voice was soft but firm when she spoke again. Now we wait for them to take action. The factions will test this bond. They will see if it can hold. And if they believe that it can, then peace might be possible. But if they don't, if they decide that it is not enough, then the war will continue. Ray stood up and walked toward her, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. And what happens if it doesn't work? What happens to you and your people? Elira didn't turn to face him, but Ray could see the subtle tremor in her shoulders. If they reject the bond, then it will mean that peace is impossible. And if peace is impossible, my people will continue to fight. We'll lose everything we've fought for, everything we've worked for. Ray's heart sank. He had known that the stakes were high, but hearing it from Elira made it feel all the more real. It wasn't just a war between two factions. It was a fight for survival, for the future of an entire civilization. Elira's people had placed all their hopes on this bond, and now it was up to the factions to decide if it was enough to stop the bloodshed. "I'm sorry," Ray said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it would be like this. I didn't realize what was riding on it." Elira turned to face him, her expression softening. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Ray. You've given us hope. You've given us a chance." Ray shook his head, unable to fully accept her words. "But what if it's not enough? What if we can't stop them? What if this whole thing falls apart?" Elira stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "We don't know what will happen, Ray. But we have to believe that this is the only chance we have. We can't give up now." Ray took a deep breath and nodded, trying to gather his thoughts. He had never been one to give up easily, but this situation was different. This wasn't just a matter of winning or losing. It was about the future of a world, of countless lives. And yet, despite the uncertainty, Ray couldn't help but feel the pull of something deep within him. He had made a promise to Elira, and he wasn't about to walk away now. "I'll stay with you," Ray said, his voice steady. "Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere." Elira's expression softened, and for the first time since their arrival at the station, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Ray," she said, her voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Your support means more than you know." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Outside the window, the stars continued to shine, indifferent to the struggles that were unfolding on the station. Ray didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't face it alone. Together they would wait, hoping that the bond they had formed would be enough to change the course of history. As the hours passed, Ray and Elira remained in their quarters, each lost in their own thoughts. The decision of the factions hung over them like a dark cloud, and there was nothing they could do but wait. But despite the uncertainty, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The bond they had created was more than just a ritual. It was a connection that tied them together, one that would endure no matter what the future held. Elira stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the stars. "We'll know soon enough," she said, her voice low. Ray joined her at the window, looking out at the vast expanse of space. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice steady, "I'll be here with you until the end." Elira didn't reply, but Ray could feel the quiet strength in her presence. They didn't need to say anything more. They had come this far together, and no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side. The days dragged on as Ray and Elira waited for the verdict. The tension in the station had reached a boiling point, and every moment seemed to stretch into eternity. The quiet hum of the station felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Elira spent much of her time in private meetings, conferring with her people, while Ray was left to his own thoughts, pacing the small quarters, staring out into the vastness of space. Every time a message came through, Elira would carefully read it and then vanish into another room. It was clear that the decision of the factions was not an easy one, and every word from her people seemed to carry the weight of the galaxy. Ray felt a sense of helplessness he hadn't experienced before. He had been in many dangerous situations, many high-stakes deals, but this was different. The war Elira had spoken of wasn't just a conflict between two factions. It was a fight for survival. For Elira's people, peace had always been out of reach, and this bond, this strange and fleeting gesture, was the only hope they had left. He had always believed that the universe was vast and complicated, full of opportunities for trade and profit. But the longer he stayed with Elira, the more he realized that there were things much bigger than credits and cargo shipments. There were lives at stake, futures on the line, and his role in this was far from simple. Ray had agreed to help Elira, but the reality of what that meant was becoming clearer with each passing day. He had been a stranger to her world, and now he was a part of it, tied to her and her people in ways he couldn't have imagined. As the days passed, Ray's connection to Elira deepened. It wasn't just the bond created during the ritual, it was something more. He had seen her strength, her determination, her hope. He had felt her pain and her fear. They had shared more than just a night of ceremonial connection. They had shared something far more profound, an understanding that transcended words, that reached into the very core of their beings. One evening, as Ray sat by the window watching the stars drift past, Elira entered the room. Her face was tired, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. She had received word from the factions. The decision was coming, and it was clear that the moment of truth was nearly upon them. Ray stood up as she walked toward him, his heart pounding in his chest. He could sense the tension radiating from her, the weight of her people's future on her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, but Ray could see the storm of emotions behind her calm exterior. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering the only comfort he could. "We'll face this together," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. Elira met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You've been with me through everything, Ray," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come, but now we must face whatever comes next." The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a bond that went beyond the ritual, beyond words. They were in this together, no matter what. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this," Ray said, his voice thoughtful. "I've always dealt with the small things, the trades, the deals, the easy paths, but this is something else." Elira nodded, her gaze shifting toward the window. "This is the path I've been walking for my entire life. It's not just about politics or power. It's about survival, about hope. For my people, for my planet, it's the last chance we have, and if it fails, then we lose everything." Ray's heart ached as he heard the vulnerability in her voice. He had seen her as a strong, determined leader, but now he saw the fear that she had been hiding all along. She was just as afraid as he was. But in that fear there was also strength, a quiet resolve that had carried her this far. Elira turned back to him, her expression softening. "We've done all we can. The decision is no longer ours. Now we wait for them to act." Ray stood beside her, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "And if it doesn't work, if they decide it's not enough?" "We fight," Elira said firmly. "If they reject this bond, we fight for our survival. My people won't give up without a fight, but we must hope. We must believe that peace is possible." Ray nodded, knowing that there was nothing more they could do but wait. The factions had made their decision, and now they would either accept the bond or reject it. Whatever happened, Ray knew that it wasn't just about the outcome. It was about the journey they had taken together. As the night wore on, Ray and Elira stayed by the window, watching the stars in silence. The decision would come soon, and they both knew that nothing would ever be the same after this. No matter what happened, the bond between them would endure. They had shared something far beyond a simple ritual. They had shared their fears, their hopes, and their strength. And then the message came. It was a simple communication, a message from the factions. Elira opened it, her eyes scanning the text quickly. Ray stood beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Elira's expression remained unreadable as she finished reading the message. For a moment she was silent, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her. Ray waited, holding his breath. Finally she looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. "They've accepted it," she said quietly. "They've accepted the bond." Ray felt his heart race. "It's over." Elira nodded slowly. "It's not over, but it's the beginning of the end. They've agreed to cease hostilities. They've agreed to talk, to work toward peace." Ray couldn't believe it. After all the waiting, all the uncertainty, it had worked. The bond between them, the ritual, had done what Elira had hoped for. It had brought her people one step closer to peace. Elira turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ray. You've given us a chance. You've given us hope." Ray smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had been part of something that had changed the course of history, and though it wasn't over yet, it was the beginning of something better. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You did it, Elira." She smiled, her expression soft and full of quiet strength. "We did it, together." The stars outside the window seemed to shine brighter now, as though the universe itself was acknowledging the victory they had won. Ray and Elira stood there, side by side, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, they had hope, and with that hope, anything was possible.